Hi, everyone. My name is Carolyn Groves. I'm a coastal planner with Dudek, which is an environmental and engineering firm. We are contracting with the city to help with the local coastal program update, which is what we're discussing in the presentation today. So I'm going to go through kind of our agenda, what this meeting is about, and then through some technical information about the LCP update that we're undertaking. Next slide, please. So the objectives of this particular meeting are we're going to share information about the project, what it is, where we are in the process, and how you can give feedback. We're going to present some preliminary results of our sea level rise vulnerability assessment and some potential draft adaptation concepts. And most importantly, you will have an opportunity as participants, as stakeholders in the city's decisions, to ask questions and receive answers, and also provide your feedback and input, which will be incorporated into our planning. Next slide, please. So the agenda for today, we're going to go through those objectives and an overview. I'm going to give some introductory information about the local coastal program and what we're updating as part of it. There'll be an opportunity for you as participants to ask questions. This is not a live presentation, but you can ask questions to the city's email address and receive answers through that. And we have some discussion questions as well for you to kind of spark thought and conversation about this topic. And then we'll go through next steps of this multi-year process. Next slide, please. So some brief introductions. As I mentioned, my name is Carolyn. I'm a coastal planner. I'm leading this project for the Dudek side. I'll be the only one actually speaking during the presentation today, but the larger project team involves Kathleen Mallory, who is the Planning and Sustainability Manager for the City of Oxnard. She's the city lead, our fearless leader on this project. We also have Joan Isaacson and Christian Mendez are from the engagement firm Kearns and West. They're helping us out with the public engagement events, and that's our project team. Next slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned, I'll be going through some kind of background information as well as the current information for this LCP update. Next slide. So what is a local coastal program and why are we updating it? So the California Coastal Act, excuse me, requires all cities and counties that have a coastline, either on the open Pacific Ocean or within the San Francisco Bay, to adopt a local coastal program. So the Coastal Act is the state regulation that governs the coastal zone, which is that narrow strip of land along the coast. And it has its own policies about how the coast should be managed. Those get filtered down into the local coastal program, which you might hear me call the LCP. So that regulates coastal development on a more local scale. It's specific to each city and county that enacts their own LCP. So Oxnard's LCP was first certified back in 1982. The LCP does have to be certified by the California Coastal Commission to be in effect. The Coastal Commission is the state agency that implements the Coastal Act. So since Oxnard's LCP was first certified in 82, it's been updated many times to keep pace with state legislation and to adapt to changing development and priorities in the city. So this new state legislation that was passed within the last year or so, SB 272, requires all LCPs to plan for the impacts of sea level rise, both because it's crucial for protecting public health and safety, and also for safeguarding those precious coastal resources we have in the city. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this update focuses on sea level rise, as I mentioned, and its potential impacts. So sea level rise is one component of larger global climate change. It affects things like flooding, both from storms and from just regular tidal inundation. It also affects coastal storms, their frequency and severity, erosion rates and locations, wave action and their intensity, and other coastal hazards like that. So right now, we're determining what areas of the city and particular resources are most at risk from those increased impacts from sea level rise. We're also looking at adaptation measures to reduce those risks and protect the city's resources. As we're evaluating these adaptation options, we're also going to be factoring in cost because all of these actions have a cost associated with them. And then once we settle on those adaptation options, they're going to be filtered into the land use policies of the LCP. So this project is going to determine how Oxnard adapts to sea level rise for many years to come, the land uses, the existing and future land uses within the coastal zone, the public infrastructure, and the environmental resources, the beaches and habitats, will all be regulated by these sea level rise planning policies, with the goal of increasing the overall community's resilience to climate change. Next slide. So which areas are actually covered by the LCP? The city as a whole only has a portion within the coastal zone, which is what's regulated by the Coastal Act and the local coastal program. So within these shaded areas you see on the map to the left, there are four distinct planning areas within the Oxnard coastal zone. These are what's actually regulated by the LCP. The non-shaded areas on the interior of the city are not governed by the policies of the LCP. So these categories are already existing in the LCP as it's currently enacted. We're just carrying those over into this new update. So starting in the north, at the mouth of the Santa Clara River, we have the McGrath Mandalay Beach Planning Area. That's number 1 in orange. Moving south, we have Planning Area 2 in red. That's Oxnard Shores. Planning Area 3 below that in purple is Channel Islands. That's the lower harbor. And then skipping over City of Port Hueneme, Planning Area 4 down there in green is Ormond Beach. Next slide. So where are we in this overall LCP update process? This entire endeavor is going to take us several years to complete. It's a multi-step process that we are looking for public input along each step of the way. So we kicked off this project in March of this year. We held one community meeting to introduce the project, give some background, get initial thoughts from the public. We're at the stage now where we're studying those sea level rise vulnerabilities. We're at that red star phase of the process where we're getting public input. We're evaluating those potential adaptation options. We'll move on to evaluate the costs associated with them. There'll be another chance for public input once we've kind of more firmly decided on our adaptation strategy. Then we move into developing the land use plan. So the LCP is divided into two sections. There's the land use plan, which is sort of similar to a general plan. It has the overarching kind of goals and objectives and policies that will govern the coastal zone. There's also the implementation plan, and that's the zoning code. So that's Chapter 17 of the municipal code. That has more of the kind of minutia and the details about permitting processes, development standards, things like that. So after we get our adaptation plan in place, we'll move on to the land use plan policies. We'll get public input on that, hopefully in the summer and fall of 2025. That'll go to the City Council for approval, and then eventually to the California Coastal Commission for certification in 2026. Also, at the same time, as we're getting those policies approved by those governing bodies, we'll be developing the implementation plan policies and the zoning code. There'll be opportunity for public input on that in fall of 2026 before it goes to City Council for approval, and then again to the California Coastal Commission for certification in 2027. Next slide. So what actual sea level rise scenarios are we studying in this particular update? The amount of future sea level rise is really difficult to predict by exact year. We know sea level rise is going to happen. As I mentioned, it's a portion of the effects we see from overall climate change. And we know sea levels will rise, but it's really hard to say exactly what year a particular level is going to happen, largely because it depends on our global action as a global community on climate change. Climate change and sea level rise are not problems that are specific to Oxnard or even the United States. They're happening everywhere, and it depends on how we as a global humanity react to that. That will affect how quickly sea levels rise in the future. So as I go through this information, you're not going to hear me say, this amount of sea level rise is associated with an exact year. We do have ranges, though. So to account for that kind of uncertainty about when exactly specific levels will happen by year, we look to California Coastal Commission guidance, as well as those kind of sound planning practices that we've been trained in. And they advise us to look at a range of scenarios to account for uncertainty and to be precautionary to make sure that we're prepared for anything. So from the available modeling data that we have, which comes from the United States Geological Survey, we chose representative sea level rise amounts for mapping. which you're going to see in the next couple slides. We chose 3.3 feet, which is equivalent to 1 meter, and 6.6 feet, which is equivalent to 2 meters. These are really nicely evenly spaced, and they allow for us to coordinate our planning efforts with other jurisdictions like Ventura County, City of Ventura, City of Port Hueneme. These levels were also vetted with the Coastal Commission. The Ocean Protection Council is another state agency, a sister agency to the Coastal Commission. They're involved in a lot of the data and science and modeling behind sea level rise and its impacts. So for the counties of Ventura and Santa Barbara, they've set these scenarios that roughly correspond the amount of sea level rise with the year it'll happen. As I mentioned, there is inherent uncertainty in this, so that's why there's a range of years given for these for different scenarios. So per that Ocean Protection Council guidance, we're using 0 feet sea level rise as our baseline for the current conditions we're measuring from, valid up to the year about 2030. That 3.3 feet of sea level rise, which is also a meter, corresponds approximately to the years 2090 to 2110. And the 6.6 feet or 2 meters of sea level rise corresponds again approximately to the years 2130 to 2150. So as you can see, we're planning out a pretty, lengthy planning horizon here. We're looking very far in the future. And again, we're doing that intentionally to plan for impacts before they happen. Next slide, please. So today in this particular presentation and the maps I'm about to show you, we're focusing on storm and tidal flooding and erosion of the beaches and the sediment. So these are going to be the two biggest hazards for the city of Oxnard that are going to increase with sea level rise and climate change. So we're focusing on those today. In the larger LCP update, we're also considering the FEMA flood zones. Those are just the baseline flood zones that already exist today that help determine flood insurance rates. We're also looking at tsunami flooding. So tsunamis are extremely rare, but potentially very catastrophic events that could happen and are associated with, the coastal hazards that might increase with sea level rise. We're also going to be looking at groundwater hazards. So groundwater can be affected by sea level rise through seawater intrusion, as well as liquefaction effects. So we're studying that as part of the LCP update. We're not going to discuss those 3 particular hazards today because we want to keep this presentation very focused, easily digestible. So we're only focusing on those 2 big hazards, flooding and erosion, but we will be covering all of the hazards in the LCP update with the public and with the City Council in spring of 2025. So by looking at all of these hazards together, we can get a complete picture, a comprehensive picture of the risks the city is facing, and we can plan for those. By looking at all of those risks well in advance, we can be prepared before the impacts happen, as opposed to responding after the fact in an emergency situation. And this type of advanced planning is required by the state sea level rise guidance. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to get into the series of maps now. I'm going to have 2 slides for each planning area, those 4 planning areas we reviewed before. There's going to be 2 maps on each slide. So on the left, you'll see a map that shows the resources at risk. Those are the existing development and resources within each planning area without any kind of hazards overlaid on the map. On the right-hand side, you'll see the hazard map. So the first slide of each planning area will show erosion. The second slide will show flooding, and I'll get into those details as we go through. Next slide. So starting in planning area 1, this is McGrath Mandalay Beach. As I mentioned on the left, you have the resources that are already existing in the area. So we have a lot of public beaches here. We obviously have the McGrath Beach Campground. We have the Mandalay Beach Generating Station down in the southern portion of this planning area. I do want to point out the orange line kind of running through sort of the middle of the maps here is the coastal zone boundary. So that's where the state coastal zone is. You're also going to see quite a bit of area is kind of hatched grayed out here. That's land that is under the jurisdiction of Ventura County. So it is not included in the city's jurisdiction or in the city's LCP. Then if we go to the map on the right here, this is shoreline position, which is another word for erosion. So you see we have these 3 shades of blue representing 0, 3.3, and 6.6 feet of sea level rise. those are kind of overlain on the shoreline to show where the sand is expected to erode to with sea level rise. There's also those maximum wave run-up dots that show the maximum extent any kind of rogue wave could get up to with this expected erosion. So as you can see in this particular planning area, the strip of land that shows those erosion effects is pretty narrow. There's not expected to be a ton of erosion caused by sea level rise specifically in this particular area. Next slide, please. All right, so same planning area 1. We have the exact same map on the left, the same resources, but on the right, we see this is the flooding map. I want to point out that this map shows flooding with sea level rise and the 100-year flood. So the 100-year flood is basically associated with a storm that would happen once every 100 years. So this is a major storm event. This is not the everyday flooding conditions, but this is, again, we're planning for multiple scenarios, kind of trying to be precautionary here. So you can see, again, we have the 0, 3.3, and 6.6 levels of flooding associated with sea level rise. We really see that most extensive flooding happens with 6.6 feet of sea level rise, and it's actually coming from multiple sources in this particular area. So since we have the Santa Clara River in the north, there is flooding that's associated with that river. So you see that coming in from the north, kind of following down Harbor Boulevard in the agricultural areas that are actually in the county's jurisdiction. We see also, extensive flooding at McGrath Campground, which is already happening, but is expected to get even worse with sea level rise. We also see some flooding down in this sort of southern portion of this planning area, coming from both the beach side, so from the open ocean, as well as that channel that is associated with the old Mandalay generating station. Next slide, please. All right, moving into planning area 2, which is Oxnard Shores. So again, starting with the existing resources map on the left-hand side, this is obviously a highly residential area. We have the upper portion of the harbor, and we also have the beach park and the Zachary Dunes Hotel in this planning area. On the right, we see the erosion map. Again, this is showing the 0, 3.3, and 6.6 feet of sea level rise scenarios. And again, kind of same story as we saw in planning area 1. There is a narrow kind of corridor of erosion expected with sea level rise, but not too significant, not getting to the point where we're actually eating into the residential neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Okay, continuing in planning area 2 again, same map on the left of the existing resources. On the right, we get into the flooding. So as you can see here, with 6.6 feet of sea level rise, we do see pretty extensive flooding within the northern portion of the Oxnard Shores neighborhood. This is mostly coming from the ocean itself. And then we do also see, again, with that 6.6, that maximum level of sea level rise, we see some pretty extensive flooding down in the upper portion of the harbor in the sort of southeastern portion of this planning area. And we also see, just a little bit of kind of flooding of the beaches in front of the hotel and the park. Next slide. All right, moving down into planning area 3. This is the Channel Islands planning area in the lower part of the harbor. I want to point out here some kind of interesting jurisdictional boundaries. So the actual beach of Hollywood Beach and the first couple rows of residential properties, as well as the interior of the harbor itself here, those are all controlled and managed by the county, by Ventura County. So they're not covered by Oxnard's LCP, but Oxnard does include the kind of immediate border of the harbor all the way around, including that peninsula in the middle. So that's what's covered by our LCP here. So again, starting on the map on the left, the existing resources, we have Hollywood Beach Elementary is actually, again, in that little cutout for the county, so that's under their jurisdiction. But within Oxnard's jurisdiction, we have a lot of public amenities in this planning area. We've got parking around the harbor, we've got parks. We actually have, the harbor businesses, the commercial and residential development that's associated in this area. Excuse me. And then on the right, we'll get into erosion. So pretty much the same story here. We see some very limited erosion associated with both 3.3 and 6.6 feet of sea level rise, but it's relatively limited. Hollywood Beach is really nice and wide and sandy. It's kind of a rare occurrence to have a beach like this in Southern California, so it's expected to continue to be quite wide, even with the increased erosion from sea level rise. Next slide, please. Okay, getting into flooding now for that same planning area 3, the lower part of the harbor. Looking at the map on the right, we have, again, some flooding associated with that 3.3 feet of sea level rise level down in the sort of southwestern portion of the harbor, as well as that middle peninsula. We do see some flooding at that medium sea level rise level. And then as we progress into 6.6 feet of sea level rise, more flooding, the entire kind of middle peninsula and the eastern portion of the harbor, as well as you see there's that very interesting kind of strip of dry land almost along the northern boundary of Hollywood Beach. So the flooding here is actually coming from multiple sources. It's coming from the wave run-up and the ocean itself encroaching onto land, but also coming from the interior of the harbor. So you have flooding coming from multiple sources again here. Next slide. Okay, finally moving into the last planning area, number 4, which is Ormond Beach. So we've hopped over City of Port Hueneme down into the south here. Starting with the existing resources on the left-hand side, we have the wastewater treatment plant up in the kind of northern portion of this planning area. Obviously a huge amount of a public beach with Ormond Beach on the lagoon there. And then some kind of industrial and agricultural development on the interior portion here. Moving into the erosion map on the right-hand side, same as the other maps, really, we see, a narrow amount of increased erosion with sea level rise, but really not too significant. Not so much that it completely eats up the sandy beach there. Moving into the next slide. The flooding here is, again, quite extensive with the 6.6 feet of sea level rise, which is, again, associated with about 100 years from now. So we do see some flooding along the beach at that 3.3 feet of sea level rise, and then it really gets significant into the interior portion of this planning area, into that Ventura County area with 6.6 feet of sea level rise. All right, I believe that is our last map for the vulnerability assessment. So that was a lot of information. If you do have questions for our team about what those maps show, what it means, please shoot us an email at lcp@oxnard.org, and we will do our best to answer those questions for you. Now moving into some discussion questions to kind of spur thought for you. Again, if you want to respond to these with any comments, input, we welcome all of your feedback. Just email us at that lcp@oxnard.org. So for those vulnerability maps, was there anything you found particularly interesting, new, surprising, anything that really made you think about this in a new way? And next question, also for those same vulnerability maps, which of those risks that I talked about, the flooding, the erosion, any particular locations, which of those seem to be the greatest priority to address with the adaptation measures that we're developing? And then finally, for that vulnerability assessment and those maps we showed, keeping in mind we're also considering those other hazards I talked about, are there any other potential risks or vulnerabilities that I didn't discuss? We want to hear about any, lived experiences you have with these hazards and how they've affected you as residents and stakeholders in Oxnard. And now moving into the adaptation measures. So now that we know what the potential risks are with sea level rise, what are we actually going to do about it? How are we going to address those to mitigate and lower those risks? So I'm going to go through kind of a host of adaptation measures that we want to get your input on. So next slide. So these measures I'm about to go through are all potential draft measures we're evaluating right now. We're at the early stages of figuring out what our adaptation plan is going to be. So the city has not made any final decisions. You're not going to hear me say, we recommend this specific measure in this location. We have not gotten to that phase yet because, very intentionally, we want to get public input. We want to get city council input. We want to get coastal commission input. We want everyone to have some chance to give us feedback before we finalize which adaptation options we're going to pursue for the city. So Think of these adaptation measures I'm about to go over as our toolbox, our buffet of options, and we're gonna pick and choose which options are the best for Oxnard specifically. It is very location specific, which of these measures work where. Things that work in Santa Barbara or in LA might not work for Oxnard. Things that work on the East Coast might not work over here. So we're very intentional with choosing the adaptation options that are really going to serve Oxnard the best. All right, next slide. So this is a kind of a general summary list of the variety of options we have available to us. We have these different adaptation strategies broken into 5 categories. I'm going to go through each in more detail in the next slides, but just to give you kind of a initial overview, we have hard engineering adaptation options. So these include traditional things you might think of like seawalls, revetments, the bulkheads that already exist in the harbor, the breakwater that's outside the harbor entrance, the groins that I don't believe that we have any in Oxnard, but in Ventura there's quite a few groins you can see. And those are those hard engineered structures, the man-made structures that we put on the shore to try to protect development. Structural elevation is also a type of hard engineering, and that's basically raising structures above flood risks. Then we have nature-based adaptation options. So these are basically taking ecosystem dynamics, taking habitats and natural processes that already happen and enhancing those, harnessing the best parts of those to actually increase our resiliency and mimic those natural processes. So this includes things like beach nourishment, dunes, using native vegetation. Then we get into hybrid adaptation options. So hybrid adaptation options are basically choosing kind of the best elements of both hard engineering and nature-based solutions and combining them into hybrids. So this includes things like revetments or seawalls that are constructed so that they can colonize marine life, and things like dunes or wetlands that have stabilized elements. Then we get into operational categories or operational strategies. So these are things we usually associate with public works, like flood barriers and emergency notification systems and management. Finally, we have planning strategies. So these are things that the planning department would usually do from the city. These include things like the policy updates we're already undertaking as part of this LCP update and collaboration with regional governments, as well as managed retreat, which I'll get into the details in just a minute. All right, moving into the hard engineering solutions. So as I mentioned, these are those kind of traditional shoreline protective devices that are, stone, concrete structures that are meant to hold sand in place behind them and deflect waves that are coming at them from the ocean. So you can see those kind of different types, the breakwaters, revetments, bulkheads, seawalls, groins. They all serve more or less the same purpose, and they do have pros and cons associated with them. They can reduce erosion in certain places, but then they accelerate it in other places. So in general, state guidance tries to veer away from using those hard engineering solutions going forward. We do also have structural elevation in this category. So this means if you have a residence or a business in a zone that's hazardous for flooding, you can keep the structure where it is, but actually just elevate it. So put it up on stilts or on supports to elevate it out of that flood hazard zone, but keep it in the same location. You see this used a lot on the East Coast already. Moving into the next category, we have nature-based. So as I mentioned, this is taking natural systems that already exist and just enhancing and heightening them to our advantage to protect development. So wide sandy beaches like Oxnard already has, and dunes, which again, Oxnard already has, those are both great environments to protect development from sea level rise and from increased wave and storm energy. So those wide beaches give a lot of room for the ocean to come up without actually harming development. And dunes are great at trapping sand when they have that native vegetation planted. They can really hold on to that sediment and also buffer development from that wave action coming from the ocean. In addition to that landward vegetation, we can also think about underwater vegetation. So the kelp forests and the reef structures that we have offshore here are also great at holding onto sediment and dissipating wave energy and protecting from storms. So we can actually enhance those natural reefs and kelp forests to help us protect landward development. This category also includes cobble berms, so collections of stones kind of piled up into a berm that's not actually cemented together like a hard engineering revetment would be. Moving into the next slide, which is hybrid solutions. So again, this is taking elements from both hard engineering and nature-based solutions and creating, taking the best of both to create a new hybrid. So as I mentioned, you can have revetments or seawalls that offer that protection, that hard protection, but are also built specifically to colonize things like oysters or abalone, and those help to further filter the water, but also protect the development behind it. There's also things like artificial reefs. You can put man-made structures like reef balls into the water to help colonize marine life. And then we have things like dunes with reinforced cores or stabilized wetlands. So these are natural environments that are great at buffering development from storm and flooding impacts. And with that additional kind of engineered core to it, it helps make it really stable and resilient to any kind of storm events or environmental changes. Next slide. Now we get into operational strategies. So as I mentioned, these are things you would kind of associate with the Public Works Department doing, and a lot of these are already in effect. They're already implemented today, and we can continue to use them for sea level rise. So this includes things like temporary flood barriers. If you know a storm is coming, you can deploy sandbags or inflatable berms or other temporary structures to protect development at risk. Things like public notification systems. So the texts that you might get in the event of an emergency, the tsunami evacuation route signage you see all over the city's website. These are all meant to help prepare the public in the event of an emergency. And then we also have emergency management. So when those severe storms or natural disasters do happen, we have preparations in place before and protocols for when those things do happen, how to handle it. This includes Ventura County has a multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan already in place that includes Oxnard, and again is planning for those rare but potential emergencies. And then our last category on the next slide is planning. So this is kind of what we are doing as part of this LCP update. We have policy updates that are going to have new standards and objectives to make sure that any development being built in the coastal zone in the city going forward will be adaptable to climate change and to sea level rise, and it'll be resilient. We're also collaborating with regional governments. So every other government in this area, Ventura County, City of Ventura, City of Port Hueneme, they're all going through or required to go through the same LCP update to plan for sea level rise. So we're working together with them to make sure we're all aligned, and particularly with the county, since we do share so much adjacent land. It's really essential that we work with them to come up with comprehensive solutions. Things like flooding and erosion do not stop when there's a line on a map. They don't understand those lines, so we have to work with the county to make sure that anything that affects us collectively, we can work on together. Finally, managed retreat is a planning strategy for adaptation. So this has been practiced on the East Coast for quite a bit. There's some good examples out there of this strategy. So basically, if you have development that has a low adaptive capacity, so very old residences or industrial development or commercial, if it's in a zone that's really hazardous on the beach, the government can buy back the property and then relocate that existing development further inland to be safer from hazard risks. And then with the original property that's in that high hazard area, the government can redevelop that into things like public parks or amenities that have a higher adaptive capacity for sea level rise. And I believe that is the last new information slide. Again, if you have any questions on those adaptation measures, if you have any opinions about what we should prioritize, which we're going to get into with these discussion questions, but please, if you have questions, email us at lcp@oxnard.org and we will do our best to clarify. Now moving into some discussion questions to kind of spur some thought. Again, email us at lcp@oxnard.org with your responses to any of these questions. So of those adaptation measures I just went through, which ones do you think we should prioritize? And do you have any specific recommendations for how they should be implemented per planning area? So we have those 4 planning areas, each with its own pattern of development. Um, so of these hard engineering, nature-based, hybrid, operational, or planning strategies, which ones should we prioritize? And then moving into the next question, for those adaptation measures, those potential measures we talked about, are there any others, any other solutions or adaptation options that you've heard about, that you've seen in practice that we should explore that I didn't talk about? Again, please email us at lcp@oxnard.org with your thoughts and feedback. Finally, we're going to plug the project website here. So we'll be keeping this updated with the current status of the project, with any upcoming engagement events that you can attend. We'll have the actual documents when they're ready to be published are going to be on this site. So please keep checking back. I believe there's a listserv you can sign up to be updated. And yeah, please keep engaged, keep updated with our project, and we look forward to getting your feedback at every step of the process. And with that, I'll just say thank you. Thank you for viewing this presentation and being engaged with your civic processes. And yeah, please shoot us an email or visit the project website to stay updated. Thank you.